I grew up in Hanover, New Hampshire and Norwich, Vermont. Ike was president at the time, and although they were separated by a bridge, politically they were both solidly Republican. If I thought about politics at all, I just mimicked my parents, and they, like the rest of Vermont, were Republican.
My family were Republicans. We used to vote what we call the bullet ballot. All you had to do was put an X on the star at the bottom, and that meant that all the candidates were Republican.
Vermont was one of those states that was rock rib Republican. Even in 1936, when essentially the entire country went for Franklin Roosevelt, Vermont and Maine were the only two states that went for Alf Landon.
And Vermont at that time was primarily an agricultural state, with the dairy industry being the primary form of agriculture. It was solidly Republican and had been so since 1854. It was indeed well into the 1960s, the most Republican state in the nation.
I remember in the 60s that Vermont's George Aiken was the senior Republican in the Senate.
Within the Republican Party in Vermont, there was a route of succession that was called the Proctor ladder.
Aiken fit that. You go to the House, you're elected Speaker, you become Lieutenant Governor, then Governor, and then maybe you go to Congress.
He did it at a time when the old mountain rule in Vermont, whereby Republicans from the west side of the Green Mountains would have to exchange opportunities with Republicans from the east side of the mountains.
And that worked without fail from 1870 to 1944. Think about that for a moment. Every single time a new governor came to the office, they lived on the opposite side of the mountains. That's how strong the Republican Party was. That the Republican Party of Vermont could just hand out the governorship according to where you lived.
Shrewsbury used to be practically 100% Republican. When they counted the ballots one day, they found a Democratic ballot. After the voting period is over, the moderator dumped the ballots out on the table, and then he sat down and he started to count the ballots. And he went Republican, 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 Republican. Huh, he said, here's a Democratic ballot. Put that over there and started again, Republican, 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 Democrat. He said, that son of a bitch, he voted twice.
I think Glenn Pierce's story reflects the Vermont I grew up in. But I've come to appreciate that there were two wings to that Republican Party. There was the conservative, urban wing, which my parents were part of, and then a camp that came from the rural, progressive, populist philosophy. And I think that's formed the foundation for the liberal Vermont that we have today.
At the beginning of the 20th century, this was essentially a Republican nation, and the Democrats only got in when the Republicans split. And the Republicans did split in 1912 because Theodore Roosevelt, who was, in a sense, the leader of the progressive wing of the Republican Party, bolted from the Republican convention. He was dynamic, he was progressive, he cared about social issues, and he was an inspiration to a lot of people.
Ernest Gibson Sr. was someone who was really inspired by Roosevelt, and he headed the Bull Moose Party in Brattleboro, and then when that failed, he rejoined the Republican Party and rose to become our U.S. Senator.
There was certainly a kindred relationship between Aiken and Gibson family back as early as 1912 and probably before that. I have come across a postcard showing a picture of former President Roosevelt standing on my father's front porch in the house in Brattleboro. He was an active supporter of Teddy Roosevelt when he ran as a progressive in 1912. And George Aiken's father was elected in 1912 as a progressive, as a member of the House of Representatives.
And the Republican Party really went two ways. Calvin Coolidge, for instance, was just dismayed and disgusted that Theodore Roosevelt walked out of the party.
The Republican Party was, for a long time, split between the Aiken-Gibson wing and the Proctor wing, or the conservative wing. The people versus the big boy interests, the big boys he often spoke of, the utilities, the power companies, National Life, the Granite Industries. I'm talking about the owners.
But certainly, it would have been hard for Aiken to get along well with people like the Proctors.
You have to characterize the Gibsons as very much colleagues of George Aiken. Collectively, they have been referred to as the Aiken-Gibson wing of the Republican Party.
My father was liberal on social issues, conservative on fiscal matters, and trying to balance the two.
There was a populism there, and there was a feeling for working class people and small farmers.
There was a continuing tussle between those two wings of the party right up until the Democrats became a serious threat and a serious equal party, which didn't happen until the 60s.
Many reasons have been put forth for why politics in Vermont flipped in the 1960s. For me, it forced a political awakening, a re-examination that put me at direct odds with my parents. The big deal for me, which I got angry about, was the Vietnam War. You weren't too happy when I dodged the draft. I remember that.
No, I was not, because, as you know, I felt that we should win the war.
Well, it's too bad because it split so many families.
Ironically, I found myself agreeing with Vermont's senior Republican senator, George Aiken. And as early as 1966, Aiken said we should get out of Vietnam.
See, maybe if we get out of there with the respect of the world and the whole hide, if I may use a Vermont expression, that would be a win.
He never actually said, why don't we just declare victory and leave? But he said something very close to it.
Declare victory and get out? He never said that exactly. That wasn't what his speech said, but that was the gist of his speech, and he was quite ready to adopt that, let that ride as the shorthand version. That's certainly what he meant to say.
I think probably in retrospect, his wisdom about getting out of there early probably was very good.
It sounded so sensible. It sounded like a neat way to get out of a terrible quagmire, but it became one of the most quoted remarks from that war.
Don't cut and run exactly, but cut your losses and then say you won, you've done what you meant to do, which is put the South Vietnamese government in charge, and then leave. Which makes me think now very much about Iraq.
Jim Jeffers picked up the progressive Republican torch for me, and his father had been appointed Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court by Governor Gibson. And Jim, when he got out of the Harvard Law School, was elected Attorney General and showed us the color of his environmental stripes when he championed our bottle deposit law and the No Billboards Act. And then was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1974 and showed us what he meant when he said that he'd rather enact laws than enforce them. We elected him senator in 1988.
He's very uncomfortable in Washington. He'd like to be in his tractor in Shrewsbury, go to the Pierce store, hang out. He was very, very low-key. People like Jim Jeffords and George Aiken tended to be more liberal on social issues, but it wasn't about them controlling. It was about how do we solve the problem, what they could do to make it better. Jim felt very strongly you can't have a mandate without funding it.
Patient has the right to go to court if the decision is...
One of the first issues he got involved in was the Americans with Disability Act, early in his career. He had a very, very strong feeling about the fairness of this issue, but it would have been a surprise to anybody that 25, 30 years later, it would have been the straw for him that broke the back when he made his switch.
For the past several weeks, I have been struggling about whether or not I should remain a Republican. I do not approach this question lightly.
I thought when I watched Jim Jeffords on television leaving the Republican Party and becoming an independent, it must have been extraordinarily painful for Jim Jeffords because he's part of the Aiken tradition, which again is part of the Republican tradition in Vermont. How admirable it was for him to have the courage to do that.
It's almost like the farmer's way of approaching things, It's sort of like, how can I do this? I've got this problem. How do I make this work? And if people were to go back and look at their legacies, he would pretty much do what he thought was the best thing and let the chips fall. But that's actually why he did it. I mean, it just, something was wrong, and how do I fix it and fix it? Very simple to him.
I really don't believe there are any progressive Republicans left in high office nationally or in the state of Vermont. But I do think that this populist, rural, progressive republicanism that was so strong in Vermont has given rise to the most liberal state in the nation. And I just hope that it kindles a fire of liberalism that'll spread across the country.